attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Good crack-a-noon to our folks on the East Coast. I am Todd Obert here today with Greg Rosenberg, Senior Manager and Sales Engineer from Sophos. And we are happy you joined us. We're going to be talking about the realities of Conti, what you can do with Sophos MTR to defeat Conti and Hafnium, it turns out, which has been just crazy, blitzing a lot of environments here over the past, over the weekend, maybe started last week sometime, but crazy stuff. So if you've been here before, you know how we do it. We like to have more content and, less, kind of chaos. So we're going to get past the, marketing part of Meeting Productive in 1 minute, and then we're going to hop right into it. So we're going to be productive in 1 minute. Then we're going to talk about what's happening with ransomware attacks, including Hafnium, what MTR can do for us, how it works, a little real world threat analysis, and kind of how these attacks happen. Greg is going to handle that. His team's been slammed, so he's seeing a lot of things happen minute to minute these days, which is pretty cool. So let's hop right in and meet Productive. Who is Productive Corporation? Well, even though you're muted, I'm very glad that you asked. Productive Corporation provides security solutions for mid-sized companies. We have a lot of specialized expertise to answer technical and licensing questions. We also implement, test, and optimize all the products that we sell. We can come in and do a full security assessment and posture review. We can look at your AD server. We can do configuration assistance and UTM services on the products that we sell. We also offer a lot of exclusive content. We're putting it on the website. We're doing it in the educational webinar today. We're doing it for our customers to keep you knowledgeable about what is happening in the security space. All of this can be found on productivecorp.com/solving security. The bottom line is we have a lot of things we can do to help you, whether that's implementation, assessment, licensing, or optimization services. We're here to help. Use the email. It goes to everybody, help@productivecorp.com. So like I said at the top, Greg Rosenberg from Sophos is going to be talking to us about Conti, about defeating it with MTR. But before he does that, I am going to launch a quick poll. The poll out there is, I just want to get a sense of, are you using an Exchange server in your environment? Just a quick yes or no. It is anonymous. I don't know. We're not using it to send out to the folks at Hafnium. But just want to get a sense. He's going to talk to it. He has some data later that he'll be getting to. So this just helps me. I'll keep it up. While you guys are kicking through that poll, I am going to tell you a little bit about Greg Rosenberg. He's a DC kid who met his wife in Madison. They were looking for warm weather, so they moved first to San Diego, and then they wanted to get really warm, so they moved to Duluth, Minnesota. Take a look at it on the map, folks. It's not Canada, but it might as well be. So he's up there. He's in between talking about managed threat response and telemetry. He's shoveling the driveway. So let's give a warm round of applause for Mr. Greg Rosenberg. Greg?
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it a lot, and glad to have everyone on here. This is a very timely discussion to be discussing some of the latest attacks that we're seeing take place. I'm going to use Conti as an example for everyone to do a brief teardown of what we observed. For those of you who are not aware of Conti, it's just a recent ransomware group that has been attacking a lot of customers out here, and we want to be able to break down the attack so you can understand timelines.
So I just see a blank screen. I don't see anything right now, Greg.
Oh, okay. Let me try again. Let's try it now. Is that working?
No, it was working before.
Apologize. Let me try one more.
There we go.
Okay. All right. We're good?
Yeah, we're good. It looks great.
Okay, sweet. Technical issues resolved. Yeah, so I really want to do a breakdown of Conti and how it works, just so everyone can understand the difference between what we consider a drive-by attack, which is frankly what a lot of people consider is taking place, versus an active adversary or an advanced attack in these situations. And then I'll kind of wrap up with Hafnium and how you can address these problems, hopefully with managed threat response and hopefully not rapid response in these cases as well. So that being considered, let's just make sure we get some definitions out of the way, kind of make a discernment between an advanced attack and a drive-by attack. When I speak to a lot of organizations, when they think of ransomware, in their minds, the perception is, oh, someone had an employee that clicked on a link in an email, or they visited a site that was compromised or that was intentionally being malicious, and that instantly pulled down some sort of file or executable or something that lives in memory, and bam, the system itself was encrypted. That's true. That can happen. That's what's referred to as a drive-by attack. They're actually not terribly popular though right now, because what a lot of adversaries have realized is that there's not a lot of bang for their buck, so to speak. In other words, if I do that and I just hit a random system, I'm probably just hitting an end user's regular old laptop, and there's not a lot of valuable data there. And in the end, if I just hit one system, all they're going to really do is reimage the system, and there's a good chance that they have backups. So what a lot of adversaries have now pivoted to is more of these advanced attacks. So there's a plus and minus here from their perspective. The plus side is they've really determined how to maximize value. In other words, get paid in one form or another. The trade-off is that these tend to be multi-stage attacks where it could be days, weeks, or even months before they even collect payment. So it could start with a drive-by attack, and in fact, that's a common example that we observe in a lot of these situations. So it could be someone clicking on a link, someone going to a website where their credentials have been phished, someone opening an attachment that they should not have opened, and there's no actual executable file in there, it just runs a script. That's interesting, but the way that we see that utilized is as an initial foothold. So when you think of an adversary right now, I don't want you to think of a single person or even a single group. There's really a lot of specialization amongst these groups. So some organizations specialize in crafting phishing campaigns. Some organizations or groups specialize in compromising sites. Some of them specialize in exploiting vulnerabilities to different systems, whether it be Exchange or web servers, or you pick the application of choice. That's generally conceived of as like the initial foothold. But once they're there, there's a whole other set of groups that then work on performing reconnaissance, answering the question, what is it that lives in this environment? How do I find the critical details or data that I can then use? And they will stage their attack as they move through the environment to maximize the impact, because if you can bring a whole organization down, they are much more willing to pay, and the amount that they're willing to pay is considerably higher. So when you think of attacks right now, I want you to focus your attention more on these advanced attacks, because that's commonly what is being leveraged in all the incidents that we investigate. So as an example, we wanted to highlight Conti for a couple of reasons. Number one, Conti in and of itself as a group is not necessarily new. These guys have actually been around for a year. It's a loose affiliation of people that we see getting together. They're primarily based out of Russia right now. But what we do commonly see with these different adversary groups, whether it be Conti or Ryuk or Doppelganger or some of those other interesting names that they get tagged with, is they commonly employ similar tactics. And the idea is that they're trying to expedite or automate as much of the attack as quickly as possible, because from an adversary's point of view, they're trying to be as stealthy and they don't want any sort of alarm bells going off that could alert a user or an administrator that something at least suspicious is going on. That's the one thing that they're always cognizant of, is how can I get in, move laterally, find the data, and maximize my attack. When you eventually, as an organization, get hit with ransomware in these situations, what most people don't realize is that's the very last stage of the attack. It's not something that happens on day one in most cases. Conti was a little bit unique, though, because the attack worked through a series of stages. And the first stage that we saw when we identified the new variant of Conti was the initial access. And in fact, what the attackers were leveraging was a vulnerability in the FortiGate firewall. The interesting thing here, you can see I've got a reference to the CVE, or the vulnerability itself, is the vulnerabilities that were available allowed for remote code execution in this particular case, which then allowed an attacker to also gain administrative credentials to the box. So you can imagine if someone is an admin on a firewall, that they can actually review the rules of the firewall, they can surveil the environment, and they now have a foothold within the internal network relatively quickly. What was really interesting about this one new version of Conti that we observed back in January was that the domain credentials were reused. So they actually exploited this to grab the domain credentials off of the firewall, and those were able to be reused on a couple of servers within the environment almost immediately. Once they were actually on the servers themselves, they were then using that foothold and some other tools at that point to gather additional domain admin accounts in this particular case, because there could be, number one, different privilege sets for admin accounts. So they're just trying to hoover up as many of these accounts as possible, because maybe one of them gets flagged as being suspicious. Maybe they just go through the normal kind of account reset process. So they won't just target one, they'll try to grab all of them. And once they had those administrative privileges, they could actually use that to start surveilling the network, or performing what we refer to as reconnaissance. They want to know how many endpoints and servers you have, what operating systems they're running, what applications, because then they can identify additional vulnerabilities and, frankly, where the important data will lie within the environment. So in order to facilitate persistence, in other words, in order to start establishing communication channels and to laterally move, they started deploying something called Cobalt Strike. So a lot of you may or may not have heard of this particular tool. The interesting thing is that this was primarily used as a penetration testing tool. It's got a whole series of packages that you can deploy to actually move laterally and legitimately test your defenses. Well, adversaries like it because it's automated with a lot of tools to laterally move and reach out to command and control servers and actually deploy other packages as well. So they set up these stagers that eventually can fire off a beacon. And normally that beacon is to some sort of remote server outside of your control, could be in Bulgaria or Russia or some other compromised device in this particular case. But the beacon is not something that's pinging every 10 seconds. They do it really stealthily. And in most cases, we see it at most sending a single ping, so to speak, once a week. right? So if you're not actually monitoring for that activity, it's lying beneath the covers, so to speak.
Yeah, that's not going to be noisy enough to be detected at all.
That's exactly right. It's very minimal traffic, and most people ignore it. And so that's kind of the first uh-oh moment that we really see is once Cobalt Strike is deployed, you know that they're gearing up for one of these advanced attacks. The interesting thing in this particular case is that the attacker lied dormant for a couple of days. And it's possible that they were automating some of this activity where they were deploying their stagers, in other words, how they were going to communicate, setting up the infrastructure. But once they surveilled the network and they understood all the vulnerable systems, they got a lay of the land to just look at the file structures. They then worked on data exfiltration. So a lot of people ask the question, well, why in the heck would they do that? With a lot of ransomware variants, they have a couple of levers that they're trying to pull to get you to motivate you to pay the ransom itself. In other words, yes, they will encrypt files, and hopefully they'll try to interfere with the backups, or they'll frankly corrupt them or infect them in some way, shape, or form. And I say hopefully, that's in their minds, not in our minds. But even if a customer refuses to pay the ransom because maybe they still do have backups, or maybe they've got a policy where they won't pay it, or maybe the ransom seems too high because they feel like they can reimage systems, the other lever that they're now pulling is what's known as data exfiltration or leak sites, where if you have sensitive data, whether it be intellectual property, whether it be, frankly, accounting statements, user data, you name it, if they feel like they've got something of value, they will publish it and do a name and shame campaign as well, which is, obviously pretty embarrassing for a lot of organizations, and they try to avoid that if at all possible. But they commonly use a tool called rclone. That's essentially a modern day version of a file transfer protocol. So they actually embedded in this rclone, once they've surveilled the environment, they said, here's the accounting servers, here's the customer servers, here's the billing servers, here's the critical application stuff with custom code. They hoovered that stuff all up, and they dropped it into a remote service called Mega, which is the #1 tool that attackers are using right now to just ship data off very stealthily. It tends to be something that law enforcement agencies can't touch, which is why it's pretty popular. And they embed the credentials for this particular Mega instance to be able to exfiltrate that data, and they fully encrypt that data as well. So it's hard to kind of figure out or see what it is that they're shipping off. So this was, think of it, they've got the initial access, they understand the data they've got, they're now shipping it off. They haven't encrypted anything. All they're doing is file transfers at this point for the most part. And this really took about 10 hours. If you can imagine, there's gigabytes and gigabytes of data. They're not shipping everything off. They're being very particular about the files and directories that they are looting at this point. Once they feel like they had that all shipped off, the interesting thing is day 4 is when the attack essentially was executed. It was the end of day 4. They pushed Cobalt Strike out to more servers and to every endpoint. And the reason they did that is they knew they were going to deliver their final payload. And they used a technique called a reflective DLL. So it's a legitimate file, a DLL, a dynamic linked library. The reason a lot of attackers or adversaries like to use DLLs is that they run in memory only. They're very stealthy in that regard. They then reached out to the command and control server at that last instance, and they said, okay, I need the actual ransomware, the encryption tools. So over the course of about 40 minutes or so, all of these endpoints and servers started pulling down the ransomware at that point, and it was off hours, right? This was not happening during normal working hours. And then the encryption events began. Luckily, in this case, there was an administrator who was working off hours and started seeing that their access was getting revoked. And they very smartly started disconnecting the network connections as quickly as possible, which kudos to that person. That's the number one thing that you can do in these cases. Please don't turn off systems that actually can erase data and tip off attackers in certain scenarios, but disconnecting the network connection is one of the best things that you can do as a result. Now, the other twist that I'll mention here is this particular organization, they had about 500 devices in total. So it was almost 400 endpoints and about 100 servers. They were literally in the process of being acquired by another organization. So you can imagine that they were nervous about how this would impact the acquisition. Rapid Response was actually able to step in within a matter of hours. It's remote incident response. Because they had disconnected the network, that actually interfered with the encryption operation on a lot of the servers, which is where the critical data live. We obviously can stop the data exfiltration at this point. But the point is that this is something that took place over a period of days, number one. The second challenge that this organization faces, they had a bunch of systems, frankly, that just weren't running any sort of protection. They thought, oh, I've got Linux systems, I don't need protection. And they had turned off protection on a number of the agents as well. So they were blind to a lot of things that we could have picked up had they been running it, namely the Cobalt Strike tool set, as well as some of the command and control communication. So just kind of reinforces this notion that you have to be diligent in monitoring environments for these advanced attacks 24/7. There were a lot of other places along this timeline where someone could have stepped in. So I just want to emphasize that it takes constant monitoring. You can't just rely on software or firewalls to block everything in these scenarios. And that is really emphasized by what's going on with Hafnium. So Todd, before I kind of talk about Hafnium here, I wanted to get an idea of where we're at with the poll results. I know you took that kind of quick poll at the outset of the conversation here. Do we have any results to share?
Results to share. 43% are still have an Exchange server they're using in their environment. So a little less than half.
Okay, that's a lot. Before I dive into some of the specifics of Hafnium, obviously I've got a link here, and we've now published even more advice on Hafnium. I want to give everyone a timeline, but I'm going to try to be very measured with my words here. I'm being conservative in what I'm about to say. I think this could turn into being the largest hack ever. This very much has the potential right now. And the reason is, and what that statistic actually bears out, is that there are still a lot of organizations running Microsoft Exchange. Essentially, if you're running Exchange, I'm going to tell you right now, it is very likely that you are actively being exploited. So the basic timeline is that there are 4 vulnerabilities that Microsoft disclosed last Tuesday. 3 of them allow for what's called remote code execution, just like that FortiGate vulnerability that we saw before, and 1 of them allows for data exfiltration. There was a boutique security firm in January that identified at least the suspiciousness of this and then actually identified the vulnerabilities themselves. They followed a responsible disclosure policy to Microsoft in early February. And then on Tuesday, Microsoft released an out-of-band patch for these 4 vulnerabilities. They actually had to notify the federal government and governments throughout the world. The interesting part about Hafnium, actually there's a lot of interesting parts. The first real interesting tidbit in my mind was, at first blush, this was a nation state attack and they were pointing the fingers at China. Microsoft officially did so, in fact. And they said that this was only targeting organizations in certain verticals like healthcare, law firms, NGOs, et cetera, where there could be sensitive data. Once Microsoft released the patch notification, essentially China said, oh, I'm done, kind of chucked everything away and stopped doing what they were doing. But a lot of these other adversary groups stepped in and started actively exploiting this vulnerability. The initial estimates for Microsoft were in the US alone, they think there were about 30,000 organizations that were impacted. In other countries, they saw another 60,000. Krebs on Security has said now that they, as of a few days ago, they think it's over 100,000. If you actually look at the number of Exchange servers that are running right now, even just publicly available, just using some basic tools, you can see almost 850,000 of them online. Every single organization that we've spoken to over this last week that has had Exchange and run some of the basic tools, we have observed exploit activity, literally zero exceptions. So the interesting kind of follow-on tidbit to this is that, you know, the vulnerability allowed someone to instantiate what's called a web shell, which allows administrative control and allows you to essentially have an administrative version of a command prompt. And then, you know, initially that we were seeing, frankly, mailboxes being stolen. They wanted to steal intellectual property. Now, after the disclosure by Microsoft of the patches, we saw with some customers multiple web shells running, meaning multiple adversaries are now trying to exploit the same vulnerability, and we've started to see lateral movement off of the Exchange servers. So it's great if you've patched. Please patch immediately. And you know, if you have plans to migrate to Office 365, just do it. At this point, it's a complex piece of software that will invariably have other vulnerabilities that get announced as a result. So, you know, if it's something that you've been working on, I'm sure Productive can help you out with that migration path. The one thing that you have to be cognizant of is pretty much every endpoint product that's out there and server protection product was blind to this. Everyone. Anyone who tells you otherwise, or a vendor release that tells you otherwise, is probably not being honest. Yeah. This is something that threat hunting is designed to uncover, these advanced tactics, because it's a legitimate tool, a web shell. It's just being used illegitimately. Even if you patch, you're not necessarily protected. In other words, if they've moved laterally, these patches don't actually clean up that lateral movement or other scripts that have been dropped or other accounts that have been compromised, or clean up the data that's been exfiltrated. So I'm imploring everyone right now, not only should you patch and look at migrating, but you really need to start thinking about leveraging tools to identify the other activity associated with this Hafnium attack.
Yep. Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Before you hop into this slide, so two things. Can you, one, share that link in the chat so they can copy and paste that link? And then there was also, all Sophos customers received, it may have been this link, but it was guidance for how to deal with Hafnium. So if there's something different or there's other resources, I'm sure people would enjoy that. And then I have a quick question about
yes.
How would you thwart an attack that was an AI-based attack?
So that's a good question. So first one, I'll have to, if it's okay, if we can just send the link afterward. I don't know if I can bounce out of the presenter mode to drop that link in, but if we can,
yeah, you could in the chat in the corner, but that's fine. If you, I can send it out after as a follow-up as well.
Yeah, I'll send that out. So we notified all customers of this. We've actually had multiple notifications about it. Matt Gangwer, who runs all of our managed threat response operations, put together a really nice video breaking down the different components of this. Sophos also now has a listing of the different protections across the different product sets that are out there to stop any new iterations of the attack. As it kind of follows on and morphs here as appropriate. And then there was another question there. I think I'm blanking on it.
Oh, how would you stop thwart a
AI-based? Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that's a trickier question, right? So a lot of, when I think of like artificial intelligence, and I think most of it is more machine learning in nature and tied with automation. It's really hard to do. You have to start with good endpoint and server protection to filter out a lot of the noise from the appropriate signals that are out there. But frankly, you can't use legacy tool sets. Most of these threats evolve so quickly that they are customized for you as an organization in these situations. So you have to fight it with other machine learning models, whether it be one for portable executable files like exe files, like this eventual ransomware would be, is a good example. It doesn't say, I see an exact match to this particular file, or I see an exact match for behaviors. It asks a different question. Does this look similar to other attacks based off of the, billions upon billions of samples that I've seen before? But you really need an organization that has a really good data set to be able to construct really good models and fight those types of attacks appropriately.
Cool. Hey, we're getting close to the bottom of the hour, so maybe take a few more minutes and fly through what you want to fly through.
Absolutely. So my point with Conti and Hafnium is that if you're looking to identify and stop these advanced attacks, you have to start with a good tool set, but you have to ask really broad questions over and above, like, hey, show me all of the web shells that you have seen over the last 10 minutes. And a lot of those will kind of go through rule sets and different models. But you need a human to interpret, hey, why do I actually see this web shell being instantiated from a system halfway across the world? Or why is this running at 2 a.m.? Is this normal behavior? So it's asking about legitimate tools being used illegitimately and having a human that asks the question, is this normal behavior, or is this in fact confirmed malicious? You can't do it. You literally just can't do it with products alone at this point. So if you're trying to make a risk calculation of how do I stop these, you need a threat hunting service to do so. Sophos has MTR available right now, where not only can we identify this behavior, but we can actually clean it up. That's what the R stands for, is remediation. So if you're asleep at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, you've got a team behind you that can take care of it. We map this against the MITRE attack framework if you haven't seen it before. Fantastic resource that shows you all the different techniques that have been observed out there in the wild. It's not Sophos lingo or someone else's lingo. It's everyone contributing to this and telling you, here are the things that you should be caring about. You'll never get 100% coverage, but hopefully you can get as much of that as possible within the constraints that you have, namely budget. And if something bad does happen, we do have a rapid response service. We're available 24/7. Just know that that's there. Have an incident response plan available that you test with even your lowest level analysts, so they know who to call, whether it be insurance, outside legal counsel, executives, all sorts of things. You should be prepared for when the worst does happen. That's my story. I'm sticking to it, Todd.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is fantastic. Yeah, we got one more question here coming in.
Sure.
Oh, it was thank you for the presentation. You are welcome. And thanks everybody for coming today. We really appreciate it. A lot of stuff to cover here. So we'll be following up with some great links and some other content for you.